Good morning. Just wanted to go over first a few things here. Most of the high tunnel irrigation that we do in the southeast typically is on a smaller scale. We don't have a lot of huge growers, so it's people very similar to you that may have 1 to 5 high tunnels. There may be more, but typically it's done on a smaller scale. So most of the irrigation setup that we do on it is geared in that direction. It can be done in a larger scale, more automated scale, but typically this is what is primarily done. On most of these it's done, I think we covered that yesterday, primarily a lot of that we see are done in beds or in ground plantings. And so typically with that we're looking at a drip tape or drip line that's done down the beds. That might be depending on your bed style. With that could be 1 drip line per bed, or it could be multiple drip lines. If you're going with wider beds, things like lettuce or leafy greens, you may need a multiple drip line to get adequate coverage for it. But here basically what I've got set up is what we call our Garden Kit 1000 with row valves, and it's almost a perfect setup for high tunnels. It comes with everything to attach to a garden faucet. It comes with a filter, pressure regulator, 100 feet of header line. In this case, it's a 1-inch polyethylene. It's durable. It's fairly thick on it, and you simply, on these, the lines are simply punched in here. But we'll run these out as a header line. Typically, what we suggest and what's done here is put a frost-free hydrant. Works very well. That could be right on the outside corner. Something like that out of the way, so as you're getting in here with the equipment, you're not going to hit that or have to worry about catching it. Generally that will be on a corner somewhere to the end, not at the middle on it where you're going to feed it from. But here, generally on this, we'll lay it out, but the garden kit comes everything in a box like this on it, and we'll take the hose like I've done here. I would have taken the time to do it. We probably would have ran over a little bit setting it up. But you're going to take your polyethylene hose and you're going to lay it out. In this case, I use staples. And this is, the polyethylene hose is fairly rigid and has a little bit of memory when you first unroll it, so it's going to want to kind of snake on you. So typically I'll use staples just to hold that in position on it, lay that out as your header line on it, and then cut it to length. We will have on the ends, you can see over here, we'll have a figure 8 end, and basically it looks like an 8 on it. And so all we're doing on it is we're simply crimping off the hose just like you would crimp a water hose. It's a very inexpensive fitting and it does the job. And then once we start plugging in, we're going to have fittings on that, and typically we use a row valve fitting is what I recommend, so that as you're harvesting, initially if you're starting out with one house, a lot of times you're going to have multiple plantings. You might have different crops on it, so you're going to want the ability to water those differently. And so with these, they come with the valve built in. They're not, go ahead and give you a disclaimer, they're not the easiest thing to turn, but it's a cost point instead of putting ball valves in. But they do require a little bit of effort to turn on it. There's a little bit of friction on them, but that way you can isolate the rows on it and water those differently. But on the end, it's just simply a 1/4-inch barb on that. In punching the holes, we can just simply take a small hole punch that comes in the kit. And then it pokes a very small hole, about an 1/8-inch hole, and that's large enough to put that barb in, and that polyethylene will stretch. So you have to put a little effort, but it will stretch and then seal around the back side of the barb on it. And then after we do that, I will, if you're laying your beds out, a lot of times those may be risen beds. If you're doing plastic mulch, your tape will be underneath that with the plastic over. You can either use dirt to cover that. It's typically what I recommend. In this case, I've used staples, but the only downside to using staples permanently is they'll tend to rust, and so when you go to pull those up, you may leave a spike in the ground, or if you forget to get a staple out, you may end up getting a tractor tire or a tiller tire as you go through. So I would recommend just using dirt. It's also free on it. But as you roll that out, again, punch it in, you're going to have your tape connection. These are a nut type. The nut doesn't come off. You're going to slide the tape up over it, and then you're going to attempt to take the nut off, which is going to seal the tape is going to press that against the back side of the barb to seal it off on it with it. Once we come outside of the house and we connect all of our rows, you're going to notice that you've got the filter and the pressure regulator. Both of these will have arrows for flow direction, so that does matter which end goes which direction. So just note that when you get it. It will have an error for flow direction. And when we connect it, they all connect one to the other. It'll have the adapter fittings in there, so we can connect those in. You can tie that directly to the water faucet. What I would recommend a lot of times is have a water hose, or you may want to cut some of your polyethylene line, and you can sometimes extend that. It may require an extra fitting if you want to do it, but some people will actually take that inside of the house and put it in the corner to where they can see it off the ground. And a lot of times you can just take the excess polyethylene tubing that you have, the 1 inch, and run it in and put it in a position if you want on a board, or mount it up to where you can see it and it's easily accessible. Sometimes when you mount that off of directly onto the water faucet, it does end up being a fairly long assembly, and so if somebody walks by and bumps that, it could be easy to break. So a lot of times I recommend either taking a water faucet hose and connecting it so there's that flexibility, or you can mount it using either water hose or the polyethylene tubing in a different location, so there is that flexibility. In this case, we have an injector outside. It's a proportional drive injector on it, and we can roll that in.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
You got it?
Yeah, I get it.
And so in the high tunnels, you have several options that you can use with the injectors. The proportional drives are very good injectors. They're precise, and they'll work with a varying flow range, but they will inject a certain percentage of the solution that you have mixed in proportion to the water, a certain part per million. And so when you're doing that, it allows for very precise applications of fertilizer on it. And so especially if you end up in ground where all of your fertilizer is coming through the drip, or if you had pots in the house, exact application becomes very important, especially in potted situations, because if you're over applying, or you're using a different type that may have a heavier load up front, or may not be injecting precisely, it's very easy to skew, especially in pots, the fertility level, and also you can affect your pH depending on what fertilizer is using there. So the proportional drive does a really good job, but there are cheaper options. Typically on those, you're going to start in this area at probably 285, 287, and then depending on the style that you get, if you get the adjustable settings where you can adjust the percentage of injection rate, typically those are going to be around 330 to 350. But you do have a couple of options there. There are some cheaper siphon style. Be careful with those. They can work, but typically those are going to range you $50 to $60 for those. So just remember, those typically are not going to inject proportionally, so you're going to only want to mix what you want to inject at that point, and then inject till it's gone. Don't count on a time frame. Don't mix a big batch like this and inject for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, because it won't be proportional. Standard, this comes with a purple Netafim pressure regulator on it, and this is standard. It is 3/4 female pipe thread, so it's going to come with the adapter fittings to adapt straight to the filter and then to the water hose. And then here you're going to have an adapter fitting that adapts to the 1 inch polyethylene tubing on that. There are a lot of other fittings depending on what you're doing. Sometimes you may want to go with a little bit different setup, and so there's additional fittings that you can get. But just coming straight off the water hose, this will work fine and comes with everything you need. But if you were doing multiple houses and maybe you wanted to have one location to do it from, then we might steer away from this. And then in that case, I would just call in and go, here's what I'm trying to do, because a garden kit may not be your most economical option. We make it set up something more custom for you. The screen filter will go after your fertilizer injector, and the reason for that is typically we're using a water-soluble fertilizer, and this is a brand new filter, but as you can see, it's already dirty. I ran that about 5 minutes. These water hoses, anything like that, are going to have trash in them if you take them loose.
It's city water too.
And it's city water.
You need a filter.
You're going to get stuff in there, but I put it after the fertilizer injector. If you happen to put some fertilizer in there that did not dissolve or was not fully dissolvable, and as we get into organic applications, be careful what you use there, especially if you're using fish emulsion, because you will have some stringy material that could make it through if you don't have that filter, and it will clog up the emitters on that. Typically that will start at the end, and you'll notice a reduction of your wetted pattern as it moves back on it. But always use your screen filter, keep it checked. You shouldn't have to, to clean it that often, but I would recommend probably at least once every couple of weeks checking that, depending on your type of water, whether it's well or city water. checking that and cleaning it with it. And we don't have the pots in here, but in potted applications on it, we're going to use a tubing similar to this. It'll be a 5/8 diameter tubing on it. And if we had those pots laid out here, we would simply run the tubing down the side, and then we would have a small spaghetti tubing, which is just an 1/8 inch tubing that we would run up and loop over, and then we would place a stake in each pot that's going to spray at a 90-degree pattern, and then we'll spray, typically on those will be about 3 gallons per hour, but they would spray a small amount of water in a 90-degree pattern to wet the pot on it. And again, they punch in the exact same way with fittings with the polyethylene, same hole punch, same exact type setup. You'd still have a header line, but instead of the drip tape, you would run a 5/8 thicker polyethylene that you could punch into and run those spaghetti tubings with the stakes off of that. So depending on your setup, either one of those will work. We do have some people that will run the drip over the top of the pots. Generally, this is like mums, things that are very high density that you may be moving fairly quickly. You'll find that it's hard to keep that tape over the top of the pots, and so the stakes are really nice to run over. They stay in, and they get a very good coverage into the pot. Whereas a dripper, if you have a porous media in the pot, any bark, things like that, you're going to find it's going to want to tunnel down, and most of your moisture is going to stay to one section of the pot. So those little spray stakes will distribute that water much better, so you get an even wetting in the pot. But another thing I want to talk about is control. So most of the high tunnels, typically when you set them up, you may not have electricity, or running electricity to that location can be expensive. And so in most cases, we just simply use a cheap battery timer controller. These are screwed directly onto the water faucet. There's a lot of different brands, a lot of different styles depending on what you want. There is from the basic timers where it's just a wind up like a kitchen timer clock, where you wind it up and it counts down on it and then cuts off. So you still have to manually turn it on, but it automatically turns off once the set time has expired on it. The type I recommend would be a digital timer. Orbit makes some. We have, which is probably the predominant one. There's also a couple of other manufacturers that make it, but if you go into Home Depot, Lowe's, you're going to see all of this. We also sell it, but it's nothing proprietary on it. But the digital timers on that will allow you to set a start time and a shut-off time. And on some of them, you'll find, especially in pots, you may need to have multiple applications per day, smaller amounts on it. Typically our in-ground stuff, we may get away with 1 application per day. But your pots, a lot of times, you're going to need to apply water more than once a day sometimes. Do those shorter irrigations. You don't want to leach any of your fertilizers or your nutrients out of the bottom of the pots. You're going to do those shorter irrigations so that it's enough to wet the pot, but without seeing much water exit the pot. A lot of times for tomatoes, things like that, you may do a 2-time-a-day irrigation, typically is sufficient. And you can set those timers up to automatically turn on and turn off at the appropriate time. They do last quite a while as far as the battery life. I will say these, if you leave these outside, we have mixed results. Typically, I rarely see any of these last more than 2 or 3 years, so just know that going in. These are at an economic price point that they're manufactured, and so it's just hard. We've tried several different brands. It's hard to find one that is made really well that will last, but they do last longer if they're inside. So running that water hose inside, keeping these out of the sunlight or out of the rain will extend the life of them. But I would still not, would not be surprised if you don't get more than 2 years out of them. That's just typical. You will for these, make sure in the winter to remove those, put them indoors, drain them. If you leave them hooked up with water in them, they will bust with the first freeze that you get, and they won't work anymore. But there are several options, again, different styles depending on what you like. Some of them have more knob style, so they're a little bit user-friendly, bigger lettering on it. Others are going to be more digital-based that you can go through. Most all of them are very easy to program, fairly intuitive on it, so it shouldn't require much effort to really learn and program those on it. And I think that has got the majority of what we're going to cover here, and I'll take a few questions now. If anybody has any specific questions for your applications or anything that maybe I didn't cover that you wanted to know.
Do you guys carry the ones that are Bluetooth?
We do. So we have those as well. Those are nice. I do find, depending on your clientele, that not not everybody likes the Bluetooth, but they are nice because you can connect directly to your phone. It's an app you download from your phone. You can go in and simply program it from your cell phone, smartphone. With that, that's Android or Apple device will have an app for it. So each emitter on these is going to put out 0.24 gallons per hour at 10 psi, and that's typically the regulator size that we have will be around 10 psi. And so there's an emitter every 12 inches on it, so it would be well under. And if you'll get, depending on the length of the hoop house, it's pretty easy to calculate on it. You just figure your total row feet times 0.24. And that's your total gallons per hour on it.
Would you recommend 1 foot spacing? I do.
I do. It works very well. The only time we really, and some people will want to get into an 8 and 4 inch spacing, and that's fine. The thing you have to watch is once those wetted patterns meet, where they meet, the water begins to go vertical. And so at that point, the water really stops moving out as much and really starts going vertical. So if you end up with an area, I mean, like tomatoes, where your spacing's a little bit wider than, say, lettuce, you want to be careful of that. With lettuce, we may want to go with a tighter, we may want to go with an 8 inch. A 12 inch is fine, but you may want to go with an 8 inch, especially if you're trying to germinate that. If you plant the seeds, sometimes it's hard to wet that enough. And so in those cases, maybe we'll go with an 8 inch spacing, but typically a 12 inch is fine. If you're really trying to wet that whole bed like strawberries, our root depth typically is only about 6 to 8 inches deep, total depth. So you want to look at short applications, short bursts. So sometimes you may want to do multiple applications. And once you turn it off, the water will continue to wick out. And then when you cut it back on, you may let it sit an hour, turn it back on, and then that'll allow that moisture to continue to move out instead of that vertical pattern, especially if you're in a real sandy soil. That can be a big problem. Typically, we're in a little bit heavier soils here. It's not as big of an issue to move the water out, but just note that on those, you're typically going to be looking at probably about a 45-minute water time. Once you get to that point, water's going to begin to move down below that 6 to 8 inch depth. Right, in case some of you couldn't hear, the question was if you had gopher or some type of varmint problem, chewing on it, would using a thicker emitter line, a more permanent line, would it be benefit? How long would it last? And how do you keep the emitters clean on it? So in that, my experience is if you have gophers and rats, it's not going to matter which one you put out. They're going to chew through either one. If it's in a really dry area, the only thing that I've found sometimes is that we can take, some of the guys have taken and punched in a punch-in emitter, just a button drip emitter, and they've created a little pan in the ground in a couple of spots for water so that they go to and drink versus chewing into the line, especially if it turns really dry. Sometimes that helps, not always. But that can help relieve that where they have the water, because they'll smell the water in those lines and they'll chew in after it. Probably one of the best things is just make sure that try to do some rodent control. There's different things that you can put out, but you want to check. Obviously, food safety is going to be a big limitation, so you just want to make sure that whatever you do meets those regulations and standards with it. But really, the permanent line, the benefit there is you can reuse it year after year. This tape is a 13 mil, which is fairly thick. You could reuse it, but generally why we go with the tape is it's a lot of hassle to try to keep that up. Roll it up, and for a 1,000-foot roll, it's about $65, so it's fairly inexpensive on it. And so most people will take and they will just wad it up at the end of the year and throw it away and roll out new. But you could do a permanent drip line, and in that case, it'll last years. For maintenance on that, typically on the drip line, it will also have figure 8s on the end, just like that, because it's a polyethylene tubing, just like this. It's a smaller diameter. But you'll take those off and flush the ends of the line. That way any sediment, anything that's settled out that may have, some of your fertilizer may have settled out and reacted with some chemicals and precipitated, but you'll just flush the ends on that, and that typically is enough to get years of life out of it, just to keep any grit from getting into the emitter.